Hey, what's up guys? Adam with A&J Automotive Repair and Fleet Services in Sacramento. So we're gonna go ahead and continue on that engine rebuild for the Bayliner that we got out back. I went ahead and got another motor for it. Like I said before, the motor that we pulled out of the boat was no good. The machine shop said both heads were cracked. The block wasn't salvageable, so we went ahead and got another motor. This is the motor right here. It's a 96 4.3 out of an S10 pickup. First thing I'm gonna do is I got all the pistons, crank, main bearings, and the main cap bolts. We went ahead and cleaned the block real good, had it honed, all right, and then we went ahead and had all the journals cleaned and checked, made sure it didn't have to be line bored and everything. The cam bearings were reinstalled with new cam bearings, new freeze plugs. So what I'm gonna do first as we go together is I'm gonna go ahead and lay the crank in it, and then we're gonna go ahead and plastic gauge it. So I'm gonna lay the main bearings first, and then once I get the main bearings in, I'm gonna lay the crank down dry, and we're gonna put some plastic gauge on top of it, and we'll go ahead and do a quick inspection and see what kind of clearance we have. So let me get the bearings in real quick, and then I will get right back to you. All right, you guys, so I got the lower main bearings in. I just wanna show you this real quick. So when you look at the main bearings, they're the ones that have the grooves in them, and there's little oil holes. When you look down in the hole, you want to make sure that those holes line up with the hole that is in the block, because that's where the oil comes from to lubricate the crankshaft. Alright, you also notice there's a tang right there, right here in this area, on all the bearings. There's a tang in the bearing. I usually put it in that side first and then push the bearing down from this side, and it'll snap into place. So that's the bearings on the lower end. If you look at the bearings on the top end that goes over the crank, these bearings don't have any grooves in them. Alright, so that's going to be normal. But those ones will be the ones going on top of the crank. In the engine, it'd be on the bottom when you flip it over, but when you're assembling it, it'll be on top of the crank. So let me lay the crank in dry. No oil, no lubrication, nothing. Drop it in very carefully. We're gonna install the bearings on the caps. We're gonna install the caps in the order that they came from, and then we're gonna go ahead and torque it down to spec. And then I'm gonna show you the little tool that we use that's called plastic gauge, and that's gonna show us our clearances. All right guys, I got the crank in dry. I'm gonna go ahead and start torquing down on these real quick, so that way we can get our reading. But before I put the last cap on, I just wanna show you, right there on the journal, there's a little green piece of plastic that's called plastic gauge. So what's gonna end up happening is I'm gonna take my cap, I'm gonna put the last cap on, we'll run the bolts down, and we're gonna torque all of these. When you torque these down, make sure you don't rotate the crank, because you're gonna wipe your readings away. So we're gonna torque this down, and then after I torque it down, I'll pull the caps off, and I want to show you guys what it looks like on the crankshaft and on the bearing caps, and then I'll show you how to read the plastic gauge. That way we know that we have the right measurements. Alright you guys, we tightened down all the main caps. I went ahead and removed the caps to check the plastic gauge. This is what you're looking for. When you look at the journal there, you could see that that green piece of plastic got smashed down. It left a mark on the main journal, and then also on the main cap bearing. When you look at the measurements, there's gonna be a piece of paper that comes with it, and that piece of paper looks like this. It's a plastic gauge piece of paper. So when you look down here, you're gonna put this up next to it, and you're gonna see where your clearances lie. I usually like to see them right between this green mark and the white mark right there is nominal. If it's in this big green one right here, that means it smashed it down a little bit too much. If it's in this white one right here, it didn't smash it enough. You're gonna have too much clearance. So somewhere in the middle here is where I like to see it. So I'm gonna go ahead and clean those up. I'm gonna put the main caps on. I'm gonna torque everything down with some lubrication, and then that's it for the crank. I won't be taking that out again. Alright you guys, the bearings are in. They're all cleaned, lubricated, the crankshaft's cleaned off, all the plastic gauge is off. We went ahead and put the main caps in. Before I put the last cap in, I just wanted to show you what I use when I'm assembling. I just use this regular stuff, number 105 motor assembly grease. I don't put a lot on there. I just kind of put a thin film on it. Alright, and then I go ahead and just put the caps on and torque it down. So all the caps are on except for this last one. We're going to torque them down. As soon as I'm done torquing it down, then we're going to go ahead and check and make sure that it's spinning freely. It should. The clearances were good. And then once that's done, we'll go ahead and check end play and stuff like that on the crank, and then go from there. But let me get this last cap on. Let me torque them all the way down, and then I'll pick up back up from where I left off. Alright, you guys, we got the crankshaft torqued down. Before I go any further, the next thing I want to check is end play on the crankshaft. The specs on this is 2000s to 7000s. What I use is a dial indicator, and I set it up just like this on the front of the crankshaft. I'll move the crankshaft all the way back towards the back of the engine, and then I'll set it to 0. And then what I like to do from there is get in behind the crank and move the crank forward, and there it is. So right now we're reading 4000s, and then I'll get back up front here and go back, and it's back to 0. And I'll check it one more time, 4000s, and I'll come back to 0. When I'm doing that, all I'm doing is sticking a small screwdriver in between here and prying it to move the crank forward, and then coming back to the front and sticking a small screwdriver in here and prying it to move it back. So check that. Every engine's different, but like I said, this one's 2 to 7000s. We're well within spec. So we're gonna go ahead and rotate this engine over, and we're gonna start laying the rods in. When I do the rods, I don't put any lubrication on the bearings, just like before, and I don't install the piston rings. I'll go ahead and put the pistons in with the rods connected without the rings, and then I'll go ahead and plastic gauge the bearings, and once I know the clearance is good, I'll remove them, clean them, reinstall the piston rings, and then go back together and torque it down. So let's get to that, and then we will hopefully try and get the heads on this thing today. But once I get that together, we'll pick up where we left off. Alright, you guys, so I went ahead and checked these 2 rod clearances and these 2 rod clearances already, but I'm going to go ahead and do these 2 real quick with you. That way you guys can kind of see how it goes. But what I do is when I take these apart, I already mark these pistons to know what cylinder they went in. So this is number 5 from the front. So I'll go ahead, get the nuts, cap, rod. Alright, if you look at this thing, I always mark the caps with these little divots, and I always mark them towards the front of the engine. So this cap is going to face this way. And then if you look at the pistons also have a divot, and that faces the timing chain, which is the front of the engine also. So when you follow it, you'll notice there's a nodule here and there's a nodule there. Those nodules meet face to face this way, and then that faces the front of the engine. So like I said before, I won't put the piston rings in, and that's for ease of checking the clearances. So I'll go ahead, I'll put the piston in. I'll put these journals almost center, and keep in mind everything's dry. I'll come up against the crank, put the cap on, put the nut on. Alright? But the whole idea is making sure that these fit correctly. also, what I look for is I'll look down at the piston, and I want to make sure the connecting rod and the wrist pin are center of the piston. So I'm looking down here right now, and everything looks centered. Alright, on some engines, if you don't do that, what's going to end up happening is that rod will sit off to the side of the piston, and then you're going to end up with some type of slap, or you're going to end up with some type of a rod knock. Alright, so we don't want that, so we go ahead and check that. I'll go ahead and pull this cap off real quick now that I showed you. We'll throw a piece of plastic gauge in here. Put the cap back on. And I won't turn it. I'll go ahead, open up another piece, and lay it to the side and get it ready. But what I'll do is I'll grab this other one, I'll make sure that my divots are facing the front of the engine. This divot is facing the front of the engine. There's my notch. There's my notch. So everything is exactly what position it should be in. So I'll come up, same thing. Throw that piston in. Come in till it bottoms out on the crank. Put my plastic gauge in. Put my cap and nuts on. The torque spec on this is a little special. They don't just have a number. So there's two measurements, 20 foot-pounds and then 70 degrees. There's 20, 20, 20, 20. Alright. And I like to use this tool, that way I don't mess up my torque wrench. This is a serpentine belt tool, but it works perfect for this. It's got a 3/8 shank. And what I do, you can buy a tool that has a degree wheel on it, and it'll show you degrees. But I know this one's at 70, so what I do is I'll come on. I know a right angle is 90 degrees, so I go just short of 90 degrees, and that puts me right around 70. Okay, now that that's torqued, go ahead and loosen it all up. then we'll look at that clearance. There's that clearance mark I told you about. These ones look good. Get that piston back out. Put everything right back in order that we had it on the table. This one also looks good. Now what I'll do is get a little rag. You can use your fingernail and scratch the plastic gauge off of the rod journal. I like to use these blue rags because they don't leave any lint or any fibers on the pieces. All cleaned off. I'll go ahead and clean up the rod bearings now. We'll go ahead and put the new piston rings on, put them back in the engine, torque everything down, and that's pretty much the bottom end besides the oil pump and the oil pan. So I'll get to that point, and then we'll start with the top end. We'll start with the timing chain unit, timing cover, put the heads on, lifters, things of that nature. So stay tuned, and we'll get to that here in a minute. Alright you guys, so we're going to get ready to put the piston rings on the pistons, and then we're going to go ahead and get ready to reinstall the pistons, rods on the crank journals, and then go ahead and torque everything down. Before we do that, and before we start installing the piston rings, there's a couple measurements we have to take just to make sure we have good clearance. So let me show you that real quick. So when you get in here on the cylinders, the compression rings are right here. There's two of them, a first and second. What I like to do is take the compression ring and then we'll put it inside the hole like so. And then I'll take the piston and put the piston in just to square up the ring. Okay, once that ring is squared, there's an end gap right there, right here. The measurement on that is 15 to 20 thousandths. Alright, so I'll go ahead and grab my feeler gauges. There's a 15 and a 20, and I'll check to see where we're at. It's actually 10 to 20 thousandths, but I use a 15 because it's between 10 and 20, and I'll slide that in there, and it looks like the 15 fits. It's got a little bit of drag on it, which is what I like to see. And then I'll grab the 20, and what I want to do is make sure that the 20 barely fits at all. So I'll come in here. Yeah, it's the 20 is barely fitting. It doesn't even feel like it's gonna go in. So that lets me know that I'm right about nominal, between 10 and 20 thousandths. So I'm gonna check that on the first compression ring and the second compression ring on every cylinder. And once I know that those compression rings are seating properly and we have the proper gaps, I'll go ahead and install them, and then we'll get the piston installation tool and start putting these pistons in. Alright you guys, time to put the piston rings on so we can put the pistons in the motor. First thing that we need to do is figure out the orientation that we're going to put these piston rings on. The first thing I do is I walk over to the engine and I look at the cylinders. Alright, so this motor here, this piston that I have in my hands, like I was saying before, there's a little divot on it, which is right here where my finger is. This piston goes in this hole. Okay, so first thing I know is that if that divot faces forward, it goes in this way. There's a divot facing the timing area, okay? So when I look at this piston now, if I look at it like it's a clock, the very top here is 12 o'clock, okay? But if I go around to the other side of the engine, let's just say it was in this hole, and I put that piston in, now that divot is facing the back of the engine. So the orientation won't be correct. This piston would actually have to be rotated this way to be correct, which would make the 6 o'clock position now 12 o'clock, okay? So when you guys get these pistons and you get ready to put the rings on, make sure you check that. So like I said, this hole here requires a piston to be pointing this way, which makes that top 12 o'clock, makes the bottom 6 o'clock. So I'm going to come over to the table and I'll show you with the old rings real quick, since we're looking at it. But there's the 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock. When I do the orientation on the rings, this is the oil control ring, okay? You'll notice it splits right there. I like to see the split right at 6 o'clock. These are the two rings that go above and below it. Alright, these help hold the control ring in place and also help scrape the cylinder walls. I like to see the bottom one at about 11 o'clock, and I like to see the one that's on the top of the oil control ring around 1 to 2 o'clock. And then these are the compression rings. These rings here, ring 1 is the top, 2 is the bottom. On this set here, I like to see the top ring around 4 or 5, and I like to see this one around 7 to 8. Alright, so when you get them on the pistons, that's the orientation. If you look online, there's a lot of little images on Google. You can check out piston orientation on Google and it'll show you exactly what you need to be looking for. That's the way I do it. There's a couple other orientations that some people do, but that's what's worked best for me in the past, so I just kind of stuck with it. Alright, so let me get all the new piston rings on the pistons, and then we're going to get ready to put it in the engine, and I'll show you how we do that with the piston installation tool. What's up, guys? So we went ahead and put all the pistons in except for one. I'm going to go ahead and show you that one since we have one more left. There's the piston right there. Alright, we're going to go ahead and grab it, and then we're going to look at the orientation. So it's going to go on this side. The front of the motor's here. There's a little divot right there on the front, so I know it's going to go in this way. I rechecked the orientation of the rings. They're all right. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get my piston ring installer. And I got a little ring installer that I put over these. And I'm going to clamp down on that. Once I clamp down on that, then I'll go ahead and I'll take the piston, drop it in the bore like so, and then I'll go ahead and cinch down on this and make sure she's all the way tight. What I'm going to do is with a rubber mallet, I'm going to hit down on this piston, and as it comes down, here's the journal. I'm going to follow that rod, and I'm going to follow it all the way down onto here, and I'm going to hit it until it bottoms out. Once it bottoms out, I'll rotate the block over, put the cap on, torque it down, and then we'll check rotation of the engine. Let me get it in, let me get it torqued, and I'll show you what it's supposed to look like. Alright guys, so we got the piston ring, compressor installed, pistons in, divots face forward. There's a small window right here, you guys can see the piston rings. What I like to do, use the butt end of a heavy mallet. Sometimes it's a little stiff. I'll come down a little bit, and then I'll knock the ring compressor and make sure she's bottomed out on the block. Once I know she is, I'll just go in slowly, and now the piston's in. So the journal is all the way down at the bottom of its bore. So I'm gonna hit down on this. And then you follow it on this side. You'll see it coming down. I'm guiding it with my fingers. Bottomed out. So now, go ahead and rotate the engine. Go ahead and put the cap on. You'll notice my marks are forward that we talked about earlier. We'll torque this down, and once she's torqued, then we'll go ahead and check rotation. Alright you guys, we got all of the pistons in, all of them torqued down. So the rods, the mains, everything's torqued, ready to go. We know our clearances are good. One good thing to do as you're installing each piston and each rod is to check and make sure that this thing rotates. Everything's free. We don't have any binding. Alright, it's smooth. The reason why I like to check every time I install something is if for some reason that crank seizes and it doesn't turn anymore, then at least I know what rod or main cap is causing it, and then I can go back and check my measurements. If for some reason I have to, you know, take the whole thing apart because I wasn't rotating it just to find that one was stuck, it kind of sucks. You can go back and loosen them all one at a time and try and rotate it, but at that point you should have already known. So check them one at a time. Every time you put a rod cap on, every time you put a main cap on and torque them down, just rotate this thing. Make sure that she's moving freely, and then you won't have any problems later on down the road. Alright, so now that it's all set up, we'll go ahead and put number 1 piston, top dead center. We'll go ahead and look at the mark, facing straight up towards the camshaft. We're going to slip the camshaft in next and time it with the balance shaft. Put the timing chain on, get the timing cover ready to go on, and we'll go ahead and start putting the lifters in on the top end. Put the lifter cover, put all the holders in, start getting ready to put the oil pan on, things of that nature. So stay tuned and we'll just keep on going with this thing.